We're here at Bisi Studio in Brooklyn, and I'm talking with producer, engineer Martin Bisi. Now, many of you have heard the album, seen the finished product before. Now I get a chance to talk with the guy behind the scenes.
Hi.
In this space, I worked with Sonic Youth, Swans, Angels of Light, Material, the Dresden Dolls, John Zorn, Fab Five, Freddy, Africa Bambaataa, Fetus, Cop Shoot Cop, White Hills. Over the years, a lot of people that I admired came. Debbie Harry, Iggy Pop, the Ramones. It was just a way to stay involved with the sort of people I liked being around and the sort of activity that I enjoyed. Material was a band, soon to be a production team. By the fall of '79, there were shows with the name Material. It centers around Bill Laswell, myself on the periphery.
We did a tour in the States. Martin, he was helping as a kind of roadie and sound person.
The idea that even the roadie was a part of the group name Material really cemented the whole idea that we're all in this together. It was Bill Laswell's idea to get a space. I immediately caught on and was like, yes, absolutely. For one thing, we needed a place to live. Saw in the Village Voice of space that had 2 floors. So that seemed kind of perfect. We could live upstairs and then rehearse downstairs, and it was very cheap.
I think it was just one of the few spaces, and the money was right, because I don't think anybody in their right mind would have probably rented the place. There was nobody living in that complex.
I like being a part of things and people doing stuff. So one way to do that, it seemed, was via tech. One thing I would do back then was show up at CBGB's and offer to do sound. And often enough, the answer was yes by whatever band was going to play. The whole idea of having a recording studio sort of cobbled together slowly. There was basically a void. There weren't that many recording studios that were affordable. Either you were just doing it with 2 microphones, or basically you had to have label support.
Brian Eno is a big part of the legend of the studio. When Brian Eno moved from Britain to New York, he wanted an environment in which he could do some of his more radical experiments with ambient music.
Brian Eno is a producer, musician. He started out at Roxy Music, then went on to be a successful producer. He lived down the street from me when I was on 8th Street, and every day I would sort of bug him for a session. Finally, he read a review in the Times or something of a gig, and then he realized that I was actually doing something, and he invited me to a session, which was My Life in the Bush of Ghosts with Talking Heads.
America is waiting for a message of some sort or another.
I got the money from Brian Eno to complete what was necessary to have the bare basics of what you'd call a recording studio.
It was a cheap way to record. He probably liked the lo-fi idea and going to Brooklyn and something different for him.
I think the other members of Material kind of massaged that through, like, hey, you know, Martin's thinking of starting a recording studio. Because I don't think I was that forward.
Bill hooked up a deal, which was great, in which Eno wrote a check to Martin and told him to get the equipment that he needed.
Eno wanted to create improvised music that wasn't loud, that was in the mode of this ambient idea that he was exploring. And I think for On Land, he wanted to have an environment where he could have the musicians in a space where they could look at images, slides, films, and react to that.
Martin was much younger than everyone involved, basically. When he started the studio, he was 17.
And it's pretty strange in terms of my history that my first real recording session, not just assisting, was the Brian Eno recording. And actually, maybe it's also why there wasn't a continued relationship with Eno. I think it went okay, but I was pretty much a kid, and Eno had to show me stuff because he thought I was going to be a little more of a recording engineer, and I was just a kid with a lot of chutzpah. In fact, that's one thing I learned from him, was about controlling process in sort of counterintuitive ways. Brian Eno had this deck of cards, and he had them in the studio, and he was showing them to me. All ideas for what to do during your creative process. So you could just pull a card out, stuff like back up one step, start over, all this kind of stuff that you would do when you encounter obstacles in your process.
We didn't really know what we were doing, you know, so just glad to be working and doing things.
I pretty much had this attitude that I could just go in there and figure it out and make something good just by will.
Brian did not have to record at the studio. He had all his Roxy Music affiliations. He was a heavyweight. He was interesting to see, well, how is this gonna work? How am I gonna sound in this context?
They staked out this space, and they were kind of like pioneers, but it was a place you could get stuff done, and it was exciting.
There was a knowledge between everyone that this was gonna help a lot of underground people make music and to have decent equipment to do it.
Part of what was inspiring really to Eno was, I mean, we were kind of taking the sort of Wild West edgy thing of the East Village really to this kind of other level.
It wasn't scary in that it was a bad neighborhood. It was scary in that it was totally industrial. So it wasn't like you were walking down the street and there were shady people. There were no people, but if there were people, you were in trouble because there was nowhere to run.
I used to play in the, you know, in the Mud Club and CBGB, and so you might make $50, $100 a gig. Coming home, you just basically pull that out of your pocket when you're walking up the subway and give it to the guys with baseball bats.
There was definitely a lot of mystery around here. There was mafia, there was gangs, there was wild packs of dogs, feral dogs.
There were gangs there at the time, like that one gang called the Confederates, you know, who would wear Confederate hats.
There were girl gangs, all kinds of weird stuff.
Back then, nobody went to Brooklyn. And so the fact that Bisi Studios was out there was kind of an anomaly. It wasn't the expensive days of today, so people could afford to still live in the East Village.
The big difference between Gowanus and the East Village was, of course, that it was all small spaces. It was all ex-tenements. So we wanted a space where we could stretch out.
I really started out with avant-garde music because that's the stuff that really most appealed to my rebelliousness. Also, I came from a classical background, and I really despised classical music as a kid.
Martin's mother was a concert pianist. I think he had a natural rebellion against that.
My parents would have me go to like the Philharmonic. I just found it unbearable. And I hated the Upper East Side where I grew up. And I hated all those bourgeois values and bourgeois aesthetics. So anyway, when I saw people manipulating instruments and making them sound very different, and actually maybe, let's just say, destroying sound, that just really appealed in two ways to me, because it was destructive and new and rebelliousness, and also had a very aggressive quality.
I believe he was an only child to two professionals who themselves came from money. I believe that when they passed away, part of his inheritance went to opening the studio. But after that, times were tough.
By 1982, Material was sort of morphing into a production team where we basically were outreaching to other music and other bands and other genres and saying, let's bring them into this recording studio. And that included hip-hop.
It wasn't even called hip-hop, really. It was just this new weird thing that was happening. A guy who's a French Algerian named Bernard Zecri, who went on to be a huge journalist and television guy in France, called us to do just beats and tracks for different artists that were on celluloid.
The French label Celluloid was some of the first hip-hop recorded.
Celluloid was interested in hip-hop, but also, oddly enough, a broader picture that included avant-garde music. Celluloid actually paid our rent for a little while, which was like $500 a month. One of the notable songs was Change the Beat, which was a Fab Five Freddy song. We recorded it. It had some vocoder. It had an interesting moment in it where there's a break and a stop, and a vocoder says, "This stuff is really fresh." It was part of the lingo in New York. Things were fresh, and it was not just in hip-hop that people used the word. Strange as it may seem, I might have even just used that to describe a no-wave band like DNA, or I might have even said Lydia Lunch is fresh. I might have said that. It's possible.
This stuff is really fresh.
But it wasn't Freddie's voice, it's Roger Trilling's voice. No one knows that, but I guess they will now.
Africa Bambaataa did some work in 1982, 83, a song called Zulu Groove.
Zulu Groove.
Bambaataa was at that nexus of hip-hop in that he went from a gangbanger to a DJ. In the early 70s, Bambaataa's gang, the Black Spades, with the leadership in particular of the Ghetto Brothers, forced a peace amongst all those gangs. That peace was best demonstrated by parties in which all those gangs decided that they would not fight with each other, but party with each other, dance with each other. Those early parties and jams were the foundation, in many ways, of hip-hop culture.
He had this whole, like, Zulu nation, a very tribal grouping of young people that all did kind of different things.
When he hung up his colors, he decided to create something else, a crew, a social network organization of people whose purpose was to bring peace and fun and entertainment, and that became Zulu Nation.
We were working with Bambaataa, who we called Bam. Bill, in a sort of down moment, said to me, you know that there's like 30 or 40 kids upstairs, right? And I was like, what? I couldn't hear anything. It was like silence. I went upstairs and there was like easily 30 kids, maybe 35 or 40 kids just crammed, sitting in every little thing, just while we were having a session with Bambaataa. Basically, I had almost the entire Zulu Nation of South Bronx upstairs.
Kool Herc was the first one to really do parties. But New York had never seen that in a park where a guy brings a PA system. So that's when it started. And then people would look for breaks, and they would look for beats they could repeat and sounds that they could add to that. Then they started scratching.
As a Zulu Nation DJ, Bambaataa would, of course, play James Brown. But then he'd also play strange, bizarre, contrasting music like the Monkees' Mary Mary. Or he might play the TV theme song to I Dream of Jeannie, like dun, 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 dun. He would play that and find a break in the song and make a mix between the two records and making kids uptown appreciate music that they might not have ever heard before, or just because it was by a white artist or because it was a TV theme song, they would, by nature, just dismiss it. Bambaataa made them consider it. The first thing that strikes you about Bisi Studio is where it's located. You know, it's in this 19th century factory in Brooklyn that has this super gothic quality to it.
The recording studio has 2 floors. The bottom floor is the tracking area where mostly the loud stuff happens. Basically the recording of instruments and some of the quiet stuff. The top floor is the control area, and that's where all the information goes in and where everything is mixed and where everything is listened to, evaluated, and edited. But the actual action, the music itself, tends to happen downstairs. People that have worked at Bisi Studio can almost all attest to this spot here, which is, for decades, has been a complete bane of any tall, actually medium height. Tall people, no problem, because they'll be like, they'll see, oh, clearly they got a duck. If you're in the middle, whoa. We're heading to down to the tracking area of the studio. Actually, this little spot actually sometimes even gets used. That's the thing, I mean, the place is so weird and so freaking complicated that's nice. There's a lot of little weird options. This is really where all the bands mainly set up. Sometimes they even do vocals down there because it sounds really good.
There's something almost garage-like about the actual recording space downstairs, and it's interesting actually working there because, you know, the control room is on one level and the recording space is on another level, so you have no visual cue. You have to take your cue from headphones.
During a typical recording session, I'll come up and down these stairs maybe 30 times. These stairs have actually ended up on quite a few records.
I remember like in Missed Me for some of the percussion section in the choruses, you taking a ball peen hammer and just smashing the fuck out of the metal stairs. Martin would just let you kind of go haywire in the basement and destroy whatever you wanted to.
This is the perfectly imperfect tracking room of Bisi Studio. So it's a funky space. I think a lot of the funkiness is part of why it sounds a certain way and why it sounds okay. It's not just like, oh, brick room, bam. The imperfection, the funkiness, all the funkiness of the ceiling, it sort of keeps the sound from being focused on one frequency, so it's kind of a broader sound. So I think part of the sound of this room is really a lot of the imperfection. A great point of pleasure or pride, dare I say, for me is that a moment from Change the Beat ended up manipulated into the next song, which went even further, which was Rockit. It was decided that turntablism, that scratching, that a DJ would really be the feature of the song.
The turntable, which is the signature part of that piece, was recorded at Martin's.
DST, he was an amazing DJ. He was like a jaw dropper. He would do all the juggling of the wheels of steel, as they called it then, of the turntables.
I became a DJ, and at that point, I started shedding like I was playing drums. So I would put the same amount of time into spinning and perfecting my skills.
He came here to pretty much do the scratching. So he really wasn't finding anything that inspired him.
I'm going through these records, and then I picked up Fresh, Changed the Beat, and I did that pattern with the Fresh, and everybody in the room went, that's it, roll the tape. And Rockit was one take. It's the first scratch rhythm anybody had ever heard that's done not just rhythmically to that degree, but melodically.
It's funny because at the time, the whole idea of appropriating someone else's music or using someone else's music to create new music, any kind of controversy about that was way down the line. When you hear Rockit, you can kind of hear in the scratch that it's fresh, like mangled, like sort of manipulated.
Rockit changed all of our lives. And the truth is, Herbie Hancock changed all of our lives. Because without him, Rockit wouldn't have done what it did. Taking a project like that and putting it in the hands of an artist of that magnitude.
It was someone outside of the hip-hop community, namely Herbie Hancock, for the first time recognizing how important hip-hop culture and hip-hop music, you know, was at that time.
Hip-hop was considered dangerous, subversive. I mean, it was the African-American punk rock. And for Herbie Hancock to get into that, he could have done it by himself, but to get into it with guys like Bill Laswell and Martin Bisi, that helped him make not just credible records, but incredible records.
Herbie, at the time, I would say he probably didn't know what it was and had no idea that it would be successful. Nor did we, though.
The greatest thing about that was the collaboration. Everyone was on their A game at that point, and that's why we have the success that we had.
The album that Rockit was on, Future Shock, was nominated for the 1984 Grammys.
To get nominated for a Grammy and to go on stage and perform and then win, there's nothing else to say. Like, I was stunned.
People started saying to me, Material won a Grammy. Then it sort of sunk in a little bit, because I really kind of thought of it as, like, great for Herbie. I think when the gold record came, that actually kind of hit me.
That was a delightful surprise, and we had got Martin had got the, the gold record for Rockit.
It really struck me. That was such an icon of music industry success.
That was the first hip-hop record to win a Grammy. That was the beginning of the acknowledgement of that culture.
After Rockit, there was a lot of interest in Material as a production team.
That sort of catapulted him and Bill and Celluloid into a whole other category at that point.
A lot of stuff came our way.
Iggy Pop came, we did some of his vocals.
And I'd say, who's downstairs? And he'd be like, Iggy. I go, Iggy Pop? I want to go get him a pink cake. Martin says, no, you can't give Iggy Pop a pink cake. I said, I can, I want to.
Ramones did a record called Brain Drain. Ginger Baker, we did a lot of stuff.
Ginger is like the drummer of Cream and just all out.
Ginger's drums, we put him in he had a huge bathroom, and you know, it's kind of old school. It's like Zeppelin and stuff where you, instead of recording in a studio, you record in a living room or a hallway.
We were continuously going through here, and it was like, wow, it's actually a pretty reverberant room. It was an interesting sound. We used to put the mics all the way up in the ceiling. I got these like really tall boom stands. I put the mics all the way in like the corners. We recorded a John Zorn record, Naked City, with Joey Barron, an amazing drummer, and he knows how to play a room, so he could actually like, whoa, kind of get drums to like almost sing in this space.
John, he was a perfectionist like Eno. Everyone was happy to have the opportunity to work with him. A lot of people wanted to record there. The Beastie Boys had called about that. I think they had that song Cookie O Puss or something like that.
I'd heard of them, but hadn't seen them live. The funny thing is that everyone said I looked like an Indian.
And the Beastie Boys, because Martin had such like a native look, you know, he had like the headband and the long hair, and like they came and they're like, Billy Jack has arrived, you know? Now, in retrospect, it's like, you didn't have time to record Delight, you didn't have time for the Beastie Boys, but the Beastie Boys weren't the Beastie Boys and Delight wasn't Delight.
Material did a record called One Down.
I was doing a song and I needed a vocal. I went to Bruce Lundvall, who was the head of Elektra, and he said he wanted to recommend his friend, who was a famous singer called Cissy Houston. He said, she has a daughter that everybody's raving about.
Whitney Houston was completely unknown, because at that point she had done a bunch of background singing, and they thought it would be nice to try her as a lead singer.
Can't stop to think about my life here today.
She had like pigtails, and she looked like she was like 12 years old. And I said, you know, if you could just, I don't remember the suggestion, but she said, I was told that I could do whatever I wanted. And I said, okay, yeah, go for it. So she sang it all the way through. And I said, that was great. She said, let me try it again. And she sang it twice, and we kept the first one. But she never stopped for a punch, I don't think. She sang it straight through, which means she had been working all night on it.
Material and me, we recorded the basics here. The recording of her voice was the one thing I didn't do, because actually we had to do that in Manhattan. And it was a quick deal, and they just did it in Manhattan at the studio her mom was used to working at.
And I think Clive Davis signed her like really quickly, like less than a year. And because we had already done a lead vocal on a major label, she didn't qualify for being Best New Artist. So Clive was always mad about that.
So they've got Whitney Houston, and they need a sax soloist for it.
I was in a restaurant with Roger Trilling. Archie walked by and I said, I think that's Archie Shepp. You should go grab him. We can put him on the record.
And Roger Trilling runs out of the restaurant and grabs Archie Shepp and says, will you play on our record?
He came the next day.
And that was New York in the late 70s, early 80s. It was a rough, nasty place to live, but anything could happen.
One thing I learned after Whitney's death was that there was really no connection between Whitney Houston and Brooklyn other than this studio and the recording of the basics for the song Memories.
If people liked the way each other sounded, they could play together. Boom. More often than not, if they were in New York, they'd play here at Martin's studio.
Bill, at the time, wanted to move the studio to Manhattan. Martin really didn't want to do it because Martin really wanted to keep the studio in Brooklyn, and however funky it was, however small it was, he wanted to make it always available and always work with sort of New York underground scene.
Me and Bill Laswell's aesthetic, production-wise, had sort of diverged a little. He was getting into a more polished territory because of him producing a lot of major label stuff, and I was much more going into sort of indie rock and post-hardcore kind of direction.
I started to travel and do bigger projects, and we had budgets, and I was experimenting with different studios and different engineers, and occasionally I would go back.
So many exquisite recordings happened there. Marty would oftentimes make deals with people based on what they could afford. You know, artists sometimes knew that Marty was a soft touch and knew that they could twist his arm without much effort into letting them go a few more hours, even though they didn't have the money to pay for it. Sometimes he did things for free.
Bill and Martin, what is really great about both of them is that they are not petty. It was never about money. It was never about any of those things. It was about creating something strong.
The running of Bisi Studio has always been, I believe, a labor of love.
Some of my favorite records are records that Martin has produced or engineered, you know, and they run the gamut. You know, there's Herbie Hancock's sound system, and also Bad Moon Rising, this terrific Sonic Youth record. Kind of a seminal breakthrough record in terms of their artistic evolution.
Martin's name was thrown around at the time. He was working with people like Laswell and Material.
I just remember walking in there and seeing a lot of records on the walls and thinking like, oh, this guy's got a really serious operation here. He was doing a lot of hip-hop and beat-driven stuff.
I think in an interview they were quoted as saying that they were working on their new record with a hip-hop producer. Everything back then was happening in Lower Manhattan. There was such a glut. I mean, there were so many no-wave bands. There was so much punk that I think Sonic Youth, in terms of their own identity, felt like they needed to be at an arm's length from actually what now really defines them, which is post-punk and even no-wave.
It was a pretty scruffy scene in the early 80s. There weren't a lot of places to play. There, in particular, weren't a lot of places that cared to put on the kind of music that we were making or that Swans were making or Rat-It-Rat-R. There was one place in particular that fostered a lot of those bands. It was on like 3rd Street and B or C, and it was called the Sin Club. And it was just a little grotty hole in the wall, but they were really all about the kind of music we were all making.
Truth is that Sonic Youth was sort of the opening into my escape in a way from really almost religiously working with avant-garde music and hip-hop.
I don't remember how many rock records he had done at that point. I sort of have a feeling that our working there turned the tide for him, and a lot more rock people came there after us. I think Swans recorded there after us, and Live Skull did a bunch of records there.
Martin looked the same then as he does now. I walk in, there's the straight long hair and a headband, kind of like this hippie Indian or something, and you know, he knew what he was doing, I didn't.
It had one of these vibes like where you got off the train, you really kind of wanted to move quickly down the street and get into his building. You'd get there and you'd be inside of Martin's sanctuary, and that was really cool.
I had no idea that the studio was even in Gowanus, and back then, to me, it was just Brooklyn. This is the record that was recorded there, and that's me with my hair sticking up in the air.
Everybody in Sonic Youth, I think, understood that it was a really important record.
We had some grand conceptual ideas of what we wanted the record to come out like. In particular, we were working off what we were doing in concert, which was stringing all the songs together without any breaks. It almost felt like this long suite of material, and we were filling the spaces between songs with either guitar noise or cassette tapes on stage and things like that. And we went into Martin's knowing that we wanted to make the record have that same feel.
It really didn't fit easily into a lot of categories, like it wasn't punk. So when you see something like that, you kind of recognize it.
What Sonic Youth was doing at the time was pretty radically different than what anybody was doing, so we didn't know exactly how to record what we were doing or how to capture it. We were hoping that Martin could help us figure out how to do this stuff. In order to get the sequential running of the tracks with no spaces in between, we had to do some pretty weird technical things to get, beginnings of one song to line up with endings of another.
It was definitely not a garage-style recording. It was more like ambitious and using the tools that we had to create new kinds of sounds and weird kinds of sounds. And that combined well with a lot of their exploration of what guitar amps can do and what using almost found guitars could do.
At that point, our equipment was a collection of hand-me-down guitars and amps or cast-off stuff. I think a guitar or two that Glenn Branca gave us. I definitely had my original Fender Telecaster Deluxe, which I'm still playing today. We were just starting to build up a real selection of gear that we had kind of handpicked.
They definitely had not figured out where they were going rhythmically. And one of the things that Bad Moon Rising kind of set the template for is that kind of primal rhythm patterns that you hear on those records were things that would inform Sonic Youth's sound for many years to come.
That's the one thing with Sonic Youth was that they pretty much had their sound, and the one thing that made them sound different was when they changed drummers. The Richard Edson record sounds completely different than anything else. The records I play on sound completely different everything else, and Steve's been on it in it ever since.
At the end of that tour, Bob said, you know, I'm gonna leave the band. We shot a video for Death Valley 69. When we were making it, it was already at the point where Steve had like literally just joined the band and Bob had just ended the band. And so we had both of them in the video drumming in different sections of it. So it was a pretty friendly transition, which was kind of cool.
This is 28 years later, and I've played on like 30 albums since then, but that record is the only one that made it onto a major label. It's probably the record I'm most famous for playing on.
It's funny how things change, because the board was once sort of considered unremarkable. It was considered to have sort of a harsh sound. It was kind of looked down on. But really what's happened is over time, I think this kind of board, an MCI board, appreciated as having a sort of timestamp to it. It's now actually considered a good rock and roll board. This tape machine, because this is what I used to record everything on. And it's sitting there a little unused. The whole issue with tape, which is actually a big controversial issue with audio people, like how much does that affect the end result and people's hearing, because things have gone digital, and there's this, you know, there's a paranoia of all things digital. I'm a bit of a moderate with all that stuff. Actually, I think that the board has a bigger impact on the sound quality than just tape itself, like tape versus analog. Ironically, for being a recording engineer, I say I'm not an audiophile. So the whole issue with tape was not a big deal. Once I realized that as I'm working with digital, the stuff that matters, the stuff that impacts even the aesthetic, even my sound, I still got my sound.
When Sonic Youth did their second record with me, Evol, they had really gone even further into the whole thing of using lots of crazy guitars. Sonic Youth loading in involved maybe 40 guitars. They actually couldn't fit into the recording studio. So we put it in the sort of like loungy area upstairs, and it just occupied the whole space.
I would be like running up the stairs and bump into Lee Ranaldo's and Thurston's guitars, just a pile of them, you know, just heaved up.
We had even longer and a bigger budget. So we were branching out in all different ways. I mean, Steve became the drummer we were looking for. That was a pretty big change. And, you know, there was a lot of cool stuff happen over those sessions. We had a good friend of ours from the West Coast, Mike Watt, come in and play bass on a couple songs. He hadn't really done any recording or much playing since the Minutemen stopped with the death of D. Boone. I think it kind of helped to coax him back into playing again after a couple of years of being, you know, mostly in mourning for him. That had a pretty special meaning for us as well.
One thing that showed how we were into unusual processes and also operated very spontaneously in the recording studio is what happened while Lee was reading the text for In the Kingdom. Thurston snuck up to the door behind Lee and tossed in a pack of firecrackers.
It scared the hell out of me when they started going off and the booth started filling with smoke, and, you know, I think I screamed, and most all of that stuff is left on the recordings.
With one final back and forth rocking motion coming to rest.
Before I saw anything, I saw him like grab his head and duck, and then I realized there was something like, and then I saw smoke. So it was really a lot. I think I can still see some of the burn marks, but I remember, oh, here we go. There's one.
We were in pretty anarchistic state at that point. I mean, there were always kind of goofy, crazy things happening around the studio that I think had Martin kind of rolling his eyes. One thing that surprised Martin when those records came out, he called his studio Bisi Studios. We didn't like the initials, so on our records we called it Before Christ.
There was always downtown, there was always an atmosphere of eclectic, kind of novelty, mixing of entertainment.
Everybody could live in the East Village for like $150 a month. So I think there was a lot of room for creativity because New York was not expensive, it was not desirable.
Vicky knew everybody and was like a really special person on the scene. A lot of people really admired her. She was just super hip and danced like a banshee and dressed super cool. You could go to the Mud Club one night, or Max's Kansas City, or CB's. Lou Reed would be hanging out with David Bowie, Iggy Pop, Andy Warhol. It's just such an amazing mix of people. Jean-Michel Basquiat staring down Johnny Lydon and see who was cooler. This is like age neutral, it's like social status neutral. Bums hung out with like the elite. It was a really exciting time. Started a band with Jean-Michel Basquiat, which was later called Grey.
Grey was a band with Jean-Michel Basquiat, Vince Gallo, and Nicholas Taylor. It was very avant-garde, sort of ambient, but with compositions and kind of a sense of humor.
We would oftentimes, play our instruments, listening for beautiful sound, listening for something that a normal band wouldn't play. And by the way, all those other bands that we were kind of competing with, they were all pretty much playing conventional kind of new wave, no wave music. What we were doing was extremely abstract. What was interesting at that time, there were a lot of artists who were in bands at the same time that they were trying their hand at acting. It was this license that we were given by Andy Warhol. He was our hero. I mean, he was everybody's hero.
I was working as a silkscreen printer, doing all of Andy Warhol's artwork. And one night I was on the night shift. I came across this silkscreen that had a cover of the Post where it said, Madonna on nude pics, so what? And, it was a picture of her and Sean Penn. I ran off a bunch of these, prints, on the sly, and I was handing them out to people, and I gave them to Sonic Youth, who, without even doing anything, put it on the cover of their Ciccone Youth 12-inch. Turned out that that was a specially made thing that Warhol made up to give to Madonna and Sean as their wedding gift.
The Ciccone Youth Project came out of a mutual admiration that we had for Madonna.
They also had an obvious affection for pop culture, which definitely no wave and avant-garde music had actually no affection for. In fact, were sort of against.
A lot of people that liked Sonic Youth thought we were, as they say in England, taking the piss. We were dead serious that we loved what she did and we loved those early records.
I'm proud to have recorded Ciccone Youth, which was a single that we did after recording Bad Moon Rising and after we recorded Evol, a sort of mashup, to use today's parlance, of Sonic Youth doing crazy stuff with actually the recording of In the Groove.
We started by laying her song on the tape, and then we were playing on top of it, and he was like, I've never seen anybody do this before. Subsequently, we did an entire record called Ciccone Youth. We went in thinking we were going to make Sonic Youth's version of a hip-hop record, like, our Beastie Boys record, doing our take on, the black music we were listening to at the time that we loved. And it ended up just so diametrically opposed to that, so we called it the Whitey album.
The funny thing about Madonna at that time is she was very accessible. She was around. One thing that I still have an affection for with Madonna is that she stated her favorite band in New York was the Swans. So my first experience with Swans, honestly, I found them pretty intimidating. Basically, their whole stage presentation was kind of terrifying.
The Swans at that time had such a huge, huge sound.
Swans was probably the only downtown band that I can think of that had this sort of persona that kept everyone's at a sort of arm's length and sort of untouchable. But anyway, so my first experience was like, whoa. I soon found out that they're actually all very sweet people.
I had heard about the studio for years due to my friends, then friends, Sonic Youth working there.
We were very close friends, and we were touring partners. And if one of Mike's crew couldn't make it, I think Thurston subbed on bass a few times. I subbed on bass with Swans.
They approached Bill Laswell to produce the first Swans record on a major. And Bill, kind of really tying things back in, came back to the recording studio here to do some of the work.
We were working with Bill Laswell, who has, as you know, an association with the studio. And he wanted to record some vocals and things there. So I went there for the first time, saw what it was like, and proceeded to make probably the worst record of my career.
The consensus was that the record was a bit polished because there was this sort of need to have it be on a major label. As much as Swans was going in a sort of prettier direction and maybe a little less focus on aggression, you know, I knew where they came from.
I liked Martin immensely. And so when it came time to do the next record, White Light from the Mouth of Infinity, just dove in and recorded there.
The records that I participated on here with Swans were The Burning World, The Great Annihilator, Love of Life, and maybe another. One thing that separated me from Sonic Youth, because the record I did with them, Evil, that record I went for making it expansive. Like I wanted it to have a sort of cinematic, almost ambient quality. I mean, it was great for Sonic Youth and for that record, but I don't see that that's where they saw their band going. But yet with Swans, that's kind of where we went. And I think that that's where Michael Gira wanted to take it.
The studio has an attribute which most, certainly New York City studios don't, which is a huge live area. In my never-ending quest to be Phil Spector, I was very attracted to that because that meant I could make, you know, the drums sound really big and things in a kind of natural way, hopefully.
This is kind of the sweet spot in the tracking room for the drums. But usually we set up the drums and don't have amplifiers and use the entire space to record. Actually, what's nice about this room is that it's an L shape. So it's almost like having sonically two completely separate rooms.
We would typically, with the drums, set up close mics on the drums and then very far mics, mid mics and then far mics. And that way they could expand at will, or, you know, being kind of normally recorded.
He understands a drum kit like in, out, backwards, forwards, and he mics a drum kit like nobody's business.
I love the way drums sound down there. It sounds kind of cold. There's something about like the echo of that room. I don't know, that just sort of feels like a cell or something like that. That's just pleasing to my ear.
And it's just a skanky basement, but it had sort of naturally decent acoustics.
My studio really works for people that have embraced a certain sensibility and understand the place of the studio within that.
Martin had a rat trap in the foyer to the basement. Lo and behold, there was on this piece of glue paper, it was a huge rat, just going "Rawr!" and spinning like this. And we're like, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? So I had some dumbbells there. We just dropped the dumbbell on the rat.
And it was over. And then I turn around to see Michael Gira in his boxer shorts standing there just about to light a cigar. And he goes, "That was incredible."
On that record, which was Great Annihilator, I thank Martin Rat Crusher of Bisi.
He only orders pizza by the slice. So I felt like we were hungry a lot. That was kind of a problem.
It was cold.
It was really cold. It was so cold in the studio.
We had that weird space heater.
We were just huddled around space heaters.
God damn, there's a lot of mosquitoes. It was like one of the first things.
More than once where like a band finishes tracking and then suddenly I hear some screaming. Ah! God damn! And I'm like, what? It goes, no, it's fine. A mosquito was eating my arm alive during that whole take. Oh.
Surprising no one fell down the stairs.
I was scared. I was anxious about the staircase.
The staircase is scary.
Yeah. The whole place is a death trap.
It's kind of like an MC Escher drawing.
around that area had been somewhat gentrified. And while working there, I noticed there was this large area upstairs that was unused. And so I proposed to Martin that I build a living space there. So I did. I built I don't know, probably 600-700 square foot box. He'd have a band down there, and I'd be sleeping on the couch, and they'd come out and go, "Are you Michael Gira?" It was really weird. But, yeah, it's just, you know, you do what you can to survive in New York. So I built that space.
Part of the whole idea of getting us a space like this that was multi-level was that we could live here. I had good relations with the fire department, and they kind of knew what was going on. This is my space. I'm proud of squatting, of occupying this industrial space. I don't know how long I'll be able to hold out in Fort Gowanus here, but maybe another decade. Swans segued into Angels of Light.
He recorded partially, but to great effect, the first Angels of Light record, New Mother.
Angels of Light was less about making something monolithic sounding or very expansive sounding, or, you know, it was more about like intimate sounds, individual sounds.
In that, you mentioned the miking of the drums. I kind of changed my tune about drums and wanted just like 1 or 2 mics on the drums for a more natural sound. Didn't really want separation. I wanted to just be what it is. I overdid reverb in the 80s, much to my regret, and it kind of really damaged some great music. So I stopped using any kind of digital effects at all.
The sort of backstory to all the Swans recording sessions was just intensity.
Before I moved in there, much to his chagrin, I would just sleep on the couch, and we would work 18, 19 hours, and then just wake up the next day and start again.
Martin worked round the clock, nonstop. So I would hear, you know, at 4 o'clock in the morning, Bambaataa and the entire Zulu Nation, or Ginger Baker, or Bootsy, or Sonic Youth.
We all felt that that was an important component to making great records. I personally feel now that you don't have to like squeeze blood, sweat, and tears into every sound that goes down. But I think we all felt that. Definitely Michael from Swans very much felt that.
As soon as I actually hear the thing, 100,000 other possibilities start occurring and things keep changing. And Martin was diligent and patient to a masochistic degree with me.
He didn't even want to go home. He just wanted to like stay here because he didn't want to break the vibe. He wanted to eat, sleep, and dream the making of the record. That also applied to all the Fetus records, almost dysfunctional intensity in the process. Like we were pretty much just killing ourselves here, but somehow the belief that unless we did that, you couldn't make a good record.
It didn't seem intense to me. Maybe I have nothing to compare it to. It's just the way that I work.
Jim Thirlwell, Fetus, a very prolific musical person who does a lot of soundtrack work. I think he was a little bit ahead of his time.
I made one Fetus album here, which was Thaw. That was the first big project I did with Martin. That was an interesting album to do because it was transitional. It was probably the first full Fetus album that I had done in New York, but it was also the first album in this second wave of technology that I was using. I'd moved on to setting up my own pre-production studio, so I'd sort of had my own computer. That was like a new wave, but I was mixing that with acoustic instruments. Martin was good at listening to where you wanted to go with something, but also without putting too much of his personality on it, which I think is important. While you're trying to create something, that's a kind of a vulnerable time, you know, and you don't necessarily want someone making you second guess what you do.
Jim recorded a lot. Jim and Martin were actually very good friends. The music really is what brought everyone together. Everybody playing on each other's albums, backing each other's albums up.
We always had a camaraderie with J.G. Thirlwell.
Cop Shoot Cop, I think I just mixed a few tracks for their White Noise album here with Martin.
I remember sleeping there, you know, we just kind of would go in there and like go into lockdown and live at Martin's house and work through the night.
And sometimes I would come in and with an album and assemble and master something here because I got to know the sound of the room really well, and I you know, felt confident if I assembled something here, then it would sound good in the outside world. And so that corner was the place where I would evaluate low end. We still got the same couch that you have. I'm sure that couch has got a lot of memories. It's had a lot of asses on it.
We never considered ourselves industrial. There's one critic that called us post-industrial. There was a really vibrant downtown scene at the time. We'd play gigs with the Unsane and Pussy Galore, as well as Helmet, Fetus we played with. It was very supportive. We were all just kind of doing what we wanted to do, really for the love of it. No one expected to make a living at it until Nirvana got signed, and it was kind of on the heels of that that a lot of us, you know, were able to quit our day jobs.
The 90s was one of the last sort of eras where you had like the kind of Nirvana explosion in the record industry, and everybody kind of went, okay, like punk rock and underground music.
We recorded White Noise, Consumer Revolt, and Ask Questions Later with Martin.
Cop Shoot Cop really says a lot about my ethics at the time. Sonically and also politically, they were very, even though they were actually on a major label, Time Warner affiliated, they were actually very anti-corporate, very DIY, do-it-yourself. And also the sounds were experimental, abrasive, and so I really liked that.
Partly that was due to how we would play shows, and so much of what we were doing was based on our live performances. When we first started playing, we would never be able to finish a set. There was always some kind of outbreak of violence, either between the band and the band, or the band and the audience, or just within the audience. And that always used to frustrate me. But then when we matured, you know, and we were able to finish shows, I kind of missed those days of chaos. First couple albums we recorded there, I don't think he had the downstairs space.
But when he first got it, I remember some people made a TV pilot down there.
This is live from Bisi Studios, and you're about to witness the blues explosion.
We did that live show with John Spencer. It was kind of like a warehouse party, you know? It was just had that kind of vibe where it was just like, you know, a lot of people from the scene and all their friends got together. We just played.
I'm here with Blues Explosion. We're live at Bisi Studios.
We really wanted to push the music. You know, we wanted to get way out there. Yeah, nothing matters except
the blues.
Except Martin Bisi Studios.
It was loud and proud.
In the 90s, when we were filming the Basquiat film, that Julian Schnabel made this film called Basquiat, about Jean-Michel Basquiat. Gray was a part of the film. We played ourselves with Jeffrey Wright playing Jean-Michel Basquiat. We had a lot of fun, you know, recording in the set, in the scene that's supposed to take place in the Mud Club. And afterwards, I sort of got everyone together and said, hey, why don't we redo the band for real? And we did it with Jeffrey Wright, as a matter of fact. We actually went out to Bisi Studios in a big snowstorm on Christmas Eve or something. I really need to dig up those recordings. Those were actually really some, you know, they were really cool. They were really great.
That's actually where the control room is, and that's indoors. You see those windows up there? This is the gray room at Bisi Studio.
If you can't tell, there's glass here, and so it's separated. I mean, the reason this works well is that you have two gigantic rooms. So if I have monsterly loud drums and then like an accordion or an upright bass, that's kind of a problem. That's hard to capture. So to have the separation really works. And in this case, just have it so that two people can see each other really helps. And also, unlike a lot of studios, both spaces are really large.
Definitely the space was a big factor in the sounds. Like the guitar, we were able to put in the huge room downstairs.
I had a room all to myself.
Yeah, he had one amp in this giant room.
Martin mic'd, I think he did 2 mics on the 2 speakers and then 2 mics probably about 20 feet away, which is also kind of incredible. I mean, a lot of studios I've been to don't even have 20 feet to work with. And so anytime we wanted like a different sound or more reverb, he would just like bring up the room mics.
On a Dresden Dolls record, on the song Truce, I went to a lot of trouble. I took like half an hour setting up. And then some thunderstorms happened. And then just as I started recording, I realized, oh my God, there's like some dripping in the pipe in the back. And you can hear this like dripping. And I was like, oh, damn, I have to find a new spot for them. How long is it gonna rain? And then because of a bunch of things, I was like, you know, okay, so there'll be some water dripping in the back. And actually, that's a nice spot, like if you listen carefully on that record.
One of the beautiful things about working in a kind of like imperfect and organic environment like Martin's studio, you get a lot of that character. When you make a record, you want to try to capture a moment in time, and all those little details kind of add and flesh out and color that picture.
That was a very significant record to me personally, because I think it came right in the sort of wake of 9/11 and like the year after that, where things were really grim in terms of music in New York.
The big rock bands out at that time were like the Strokes and the White Stripes. Fine, but it didn't do anything for me. And then we had the 2001 stolen election with George Bush, that whole Bush era where I think a lot of people just were like going, ugh, God, what the fuck?
When I met the Dresden Dolls, I was pretty amazed that it actually reminded me of a lot of the youthful energy that I had in New York in the 80s.
It was fortunate that Amanda met him at a party, and Michael Gira was there and Martin was there and people were just kind of mingling around. That's, I think, what initiated the sort of the friendship and the conversation about working together. When we came down to the decision of who we were gonna have record, Martin was the obvious choice. You know, we were certainly impressed with the fact that he had worked with a lot of artists like Swans and Sonic Youth and so on that we felt sort of akin to. It was very much like, let's connect and let's grow this thing and see where it goes.
Dresden Dolls made a lot of fans. So it was really quite a phenomenon. And it really sort of happened in this void of nothing happening in New York.
It was my first full-length album recording, and Amanda's as well, and a harrowing experience, to say the least. I mean, there's a lot riding on the line, you know, when you're a young band and you want everything to go well. And yet we were still trying to find our sound, but we had a particular vision that we wanted to at least aim for, and Martin definitely had that background. Tracking part and the mixing part were two distinctly different periods of that recording session. The tracking process was really difficult for me. Amanda was like, get out! I want to be completely alone during like the recording of like the piano parts and the vocals. She just wanted to sort of buckle down and do it with Martin, and that probably was a good way to do back then, you know, when it was very new and she had a lot of figuring out to do. And then the mixing part was hilarious. I'll never forget when Martin was doing his like rain dance thing and sort of like dancing around his chair going like, and like beating a drum, and you had to be there.
That's actually your guitar just at the end.
Are you serious?
And actually, I like that. That means that one smart aleck out there will actually go,
The man's blood is half coffee, and he's just like, you know, kind of hyper-focused or sort of manic, and we joked around a lot. He did incredible stuff on the song Gravity, using the Memory Man. It's just like an analog delay module, like a tape loop, I think, that sort of like slows down and speeds up so you can catch a quick section and repeat it and drag it sort of, or the opposite of that. Great demonstration, I know.
It's funny, a lot of the old stuff, one thing that's really good is that it's very manipulative. I got used to doing a lot of experimenting with little bits of equipment like tape loops. This thing is on a lot of even the hip-hop stuff where there's just like weird little sounds in the back.
Unlike a lot of engineers today where everything is just at the push of a button and on Pro Tools and you just sort of like nip and tuck and everything is just like deleted and added and copied and pasted and all that kind of stuff. And Martin was at the board twisting knobs and riding faders and, you know, it was I think that was a good one. Really, you know, a visceral part of it. And that's great. That brings a lot of character to it. And I feel fortunate that my band caught that era where we got to work with a great tape engineer too. And it was amazing watching Martin like sort of like adjust the reels and get everything ready and cut the tape and make all the different edits and walk away with like 70 pounds of our album. I don't know if I've made a record like that since. Ultimately, we wound up with a record that we were incredibly proud of and had a great time, and I still love listening back to that album.
We were trying to figure out who would suit us pretty well, and then I looked at half my record collection and realized that he'd recorded, you know, the good half. You know?
Backwards thing is ridiculous.
I fade in
it's
the
so
room
badass.
mics. Like I fade
so
in.
much bull.
Like I fade in the room mics and fade in the guitar loop.
Swans, Sonic Youth, John Zorn, Africa Bombada, Herbie Hancock, Helmet. I mean, anyone who's been in this area and made music that mattered at one point connected with this guy over the last 35 years.
1, 2, 3. I feel like I'm doing as much as I can to participate in the continuation of music that I like and believe in.
Listening to it this time, it wasn't like how I thought I heard it when we played it. So maybe we should scrutinize that.
I love playing with violent femmes because to me that's the type of music that has the kind of ethics and ideals and performance style that I love.
I like it. I like how it sounds.
I like the idea of not having a melody instrument solo, but have the drum solo, because we haven't actually done that before. We could just take it from.
Yeah. Take it from there. Keep it rolling, Martin.
Just the way he mic'd our instruments and the way he did my vocals, it allowed for us to have a good foundation for the mixing. And he does everything analog, which at first I was really kind of scared about, but it's been going really well.
I almost feel like Martin and the space have kind of become this one weird symbiotic thing where he knew how to use the space to get the sounds he wanted or to copy and paste things in his computer from the 1990s.
Also, a big part of it for us was that he was excited, and I think he was having fun too, I hope.
Making this album with him has been amazing. This room has such a presence. It's enveloping.
To me, the whole thing just happened really, really positively.
I didn't even know it hit me.
Yeah, all of a sudden we had a record.
So we're in the basement of where the studio is, of the building. And there's a lake that goes all through the building, all under the building, across 3rd Avenue and under the Whole Foods construction site. So I actually have access to it here. And so here is the pond.
I mean, the Gowanus area is a little bit of a time capsule because from my eyes, it hasn't really changed that much.
There's aspects of this area that are really pretty much the same. I mean, pretty much between here and Carroll Street, apart from the Whole Foods that's about to go in.
When I first heard that Whole Foods was moving into the neighborhood, my feeling was that this neighborhood was a bit development-proof. What got my thinking changing about Whole Foods as opposed to Staples, which opened up a block away. It's a combination of what happens when the area becomes desirable for a different kind of use. A residential use is about double of manufacturing. So as soon as this place becomes operational, the value per square foot of this building can nearly double. It's documented. We see it happen in other urban areas, and we see it in other areas of Brooklyn.
When I heard that Whole Foods was coming into the neighborhood, the first thing I thought was, there goes the neighborhood. I mean, it's very complicated. Obviously, no one wants to live here because it's so polluted. But what you have from that is space to be creative.
The Rude Mechanic Orchestra started in 2004. I'm one of the remaining original members of the project. This is a project that was started really as a way to challenge the Republican National Convention when it was in New York City in 2004. A lot of activists on the left were really mad, rightfully so, that the RNC decided to be in New York City of all places for its convention. It was a really amazing time when the RNC came to town. I mean, it was a terrible time, but it was also a really artistically and politically fruitful time. There's something about having a common enemy in New York that really got everyone kind of thinking about how they could challenge what was going on. The first day that we recorded at Martin's Space with Don Godwin for the new album, Too Big to Fail, was the first day of the occupation at Zuccotti Park. It was very fitting that everything kind of happened all at once. And so from then on, we were very, very involved in Occupy Wall Street.
The protest movement picked up steam, and that was inspiring. So a lot of my own personal stuff has some of the sonic expression in some ways of a lot of that. I loved how brass marching bands sounded in the canyons of Lower Manhattan during protests. And then there's a lot of group vocals, and that's because I love the sounds of like group chanting.
My thinking right now about the situation in this neighborhood is really the situation is for Brooklyn, and it's a situation that I'm hearing it's kind of across the country, which is that low-income and middle-class housing is under attack. There are no policies in place that are really allowing the low-income, middle-class communities who actually create a lot of the beautiful art that you see to live here. It makes me feel like this particular community that I care a lot about is not much longer for this world.
It's actually amazing how busy it is with all this traffic. You never would have seen this when I first moved here. It was like kind of just desolate and maybe one car way down there. And I've been hearing from people in the buildings around here of like a real clear spike in developers contacting the buildings, contacting owners, interested in snapping up whatever they can. With this land rush, just because of this damn grocery store, artists and artist organizations won't be moving to Gowanus in the next few years. It's just kind of, it's gonna happen somewhere, but it doesn't look like this is gonna be that anymore. And of course, it's the old thing of like, what's charming about it will eventually be destroyed. And that's true. At what point am I gonna ask myself, do I even wanna be here anymore when I'm like the last one standing or when everything's been pulled? And you know, I actually wanna be the last one standing, frankly, but what happens when too much is, when it just goes somewhere else, all the magic of what has happened here? Let's go in, I guess I knew I'd go in. I'm just not gonna buy anything, frankly. Yeah, I'm getting a real emotional tingle about it. There's apparently a vinyl collection. These are kind of my peers shopping here. I mean, they're maybe a little more affluent than certain other peers, but that's the sort of disenchantment I'm feeling. Not a treasure trove for crate diggers yet. I mean, they've got Kings of Leon. I guess that's exciting. It really feels like a whole world is just kind of over. I mean, it's amazing what one store will do. As far as my being here, I think in my mind, maybe I wouldn't have imagined being here for that long. There was an evolution in my mind about that, about like appreciating the space and how it was important to like pitch your tent somewhere. That the place informed what I did, what inspired me, and in some way that's even mysterious to me, went along with the drama of this canal.
My impression is that in the 80s, it'd be kind of like fucking around and being a band. You can't do that here anymore, so yeah, you have to work hard.
I think it influences what we do just because I have to work 40 to 50 hours a week and then be in the band.
I am sympathetic with young people today in New York, you know, trying to find time to create and be creative and productive. It's hard.
Honey, let's move somewhere else.
No. The issue of gentrification in a city like New York, there's kind of a sweet spot where things actually sort of get better for a while. And then there's a point where I'm overtaken by the thing that I helped kind of bring to fore.
I moved to Dumbo in about 1987. I don't like Dumbo now. Someone told me that when the area that you live in gets developed, that there's a 10-year resentment phase that you go through until you actually kind of assimilate what's happened. I'm still in the resentment phase.
Before it was like 90% people pursuing the lifestyle, no matter what it took. And now I think most of the people here are like looking at the New York lifestyle, and they're not really a part of it.
New York, for me, has a lot of memories, and I just didn't want to be in a place that was kind of like living in the back of your mind, you know? I just wanted to do something fresh. So I got out of Dodge.
This town, forget about it. When I moved here, it was a total affordable working class town with a little bit of danger. It was filled with artists and musicians, and now it's just like, I have a couple friends left here, but...
I actually have a lot of optimism in a sense. I don't know if that optimism extends to Gowanus, and I don't know if that optimism can extend to me personally, but I think that basically a big movement has just exploded from what was a very small scene of like indie rock, experimentalism, post-punk, and counterculture, and it's really kind of snowballed into something big.
I hope Martin continues to run Bisi Studios. It's an important thing for musicians.
I think Martin's studio space is pretty much one of a kind. You can do in it what you will, and I think it allows everyone to have this kind of breath. There's this whole feeling that you can kind of go there and experiment and, you know, live there in a sense for a little while.
So you don't want to see just the place, but you want to see, like, also the people continue and have a ground to do that.
It's a staple of a kind of New York culture of sound and chaos, and in the way that, you know, clubs like CBGB's or Max's Kansas City, it's like that, and it has that kind of history.
One of those historical places that can actually generate new, inspiring material.